Hello, welcome. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you're joining us today. And we're very glad you're joining despite the prevalent Zoom fatigue everywhere. So it's good to see you all. My name is Julia Schöneberg, and together with my colleague Juan Terreria, I am co-chairing the Cost Action Network on Decolonizing Development, Research, Teaching and Practice. And today marks the official launch of our network, so we're very excited about this. The title of today's event is very much also part of the network's agenda. And in our collaborative and convivial work within the next 4 years, we want to explore what must be done to radically change structures, institutions, and spaces in research, teaching, and practice that maintain racism, discrimination, exclusion, inequalities, and injustices. In light of our own positionalities, we obviously also need to closely scrutinize what a network of European scholars can and cannot achieve in this regard. For that reason, we are very happy that we have 3 leading critical scholars this afternoon that are joining the conversation, and we look forward to discussing practical implications and imperatives of the decolonizing agenda with you all, and especially with Olivia Rutter-Zipwa, Kalpana Wilson, and Rosalba Icaza. Very warm welcome to you. After the roundtable, there's space for questions and comments, and Juan will explain you the technicalities of that in a moment. And also after the formal part of this meeting, we will leave the Zoom room open for some informal exchanges for lack of a nice wine reception. So, Juan, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Some technicalities, as Julia said. As you can see in the screen, we have a Twitter account, and the hashtag for the event today is that one, Beyond Lip Service. So feel free to share comments, ideas, pictures, whatever, while the conversation is happening. After the conversation, as Julia said, we are going to have a dialogue between the audience and the speakers. And we are going to channel this dialogue through an app called Slido. So I'm going to share, give me a second, in the chat. I'm trying to. Okay, there you have the website and the code. So please, if you go to the website, you'll see that the website is going to ask for a code. You write there 38454. And you will get into a website where you can type your question. So any question you would like to ask to the speakers, type it there. And we are going to have Lata Narayaswamy helping us, checking what questions are we asking, so we can ask them to the speakers. Slido has something very positive. As you will see, you can type your questions, but also you can vote or like the questions you find more interesting or meaningful. So please write your questions if you have any question, but if you don't have questions, you can also vote, because Lata is going to check which are the most, let's say, popular questions, so we can send these questions to the speakers. So accordingly, as you know, we have the chat on Zoom. If you need to use the chat to contact anyone, or if you have any problem with the sound or the image, use the chat. But please, if you have any question, do it through Slido. Don't do it through the chat to avoid 2 parallel conversations. Do it through Slido, and we will ask the speakers the questions. So, Julia, that was my technicality part.
Thanks, Juan. So now, before we pass on to the roundtable panelists, I would like to give the floor to Aram Ziai, who has kindly agreed to say a few words to launch us into the topic. So Aram Ziai is Professor of Development and Postcolonial Studies at Kassel University in Germany. And beyond serving as a grant holder representative for our network, he's also the director of the Global Partnership Network, which is one of the Exceed centers for excellence and exchange, which is funded by the German Academic Exchange Service and the German Ministry BMZ. Aram has published widely on post-development, post-colonial political science and development policy. And most recently, together with Daniel Bendix and Franziska Müller, he has co-edited the volume Beyond the Master's Tools, Decolonizing Knowledge Orders, Research Methodologies and Teaching, which has been published by Rowan and Littlefield in London. So much for that. Aram, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks a lot, Julia. So hopefully we will now be able, oh, wonderful. The screen sharing works well. So that's great. Yes, a very warm welcome from my side as well. Welcome everyone to the kickoff conference of the Cost Action Decolonizing Development. We're very happy to announce that the Coast Research Network has successfully been launched and that roughly 150 participants from 27 countries are taking part. And we are really, really happy to find so many brilliant scholars in our midst, 3 of which have kindly agreed to join the roundtable later on. So thank you for that. So let me start this conference by illustrating why we think development research, teaching, practice, and indeed our whole worldview needs to be decolonized, why we think it is still shaped by colonial patterns. And let me illustrate this with a little story, taking you on a journey to Genghis Khan. So our journey starts way back in the beginning of the 15th century, and it starts with the navigator of the then largest and most technically advanced maritime fleet, and his name is Zheng He. And the words of the great admiral who reports from his voyages of discovery have been handed down. He said, "We have traveled more than 50,000 nautical miles of the mighty ocean and have cast our eyes on barbaric regions far away." And looking at his voyages, in which he circumnavigated the Asian continent southwards, I realized that one of these barbaric regions Zheng He was probably referring to was the region where my father was born, today's Iran. And then I wondered what would have happened if he had circled the Asian continent in the opposite direction. And new slide, please. And one of these barbaric regions he discovered had actually been the place where my mother was born, today's Germany. And what if he got the strange idea that this western corner of Asia was a continent on its own? And what if this continent was named after the one who allegedly discovered it? And what if Zheng He had mistakenly assumed that this region was part of Ethiopia? Strange questions, I admit, but looking at the continent of America and Columbus, they are not that strange. And what, to make things even more strange, what if maps were today centered around China and our continent in which we are now, here, was at the bottom? Well, today, we would live as Ethiopians in Genghis Khan. And my home, which you see on the next slide, would probably be situated in the former colony of Chinese central Genghis Khan. And maybe this colonial history we have had been a very bloody one. And maybe an anti-colonial uprising in the province of Hessia, where I live, had been met with a genocide by the colonizers. Few Hessians had survived. And although after intra-Asian wars, compensations for war crimes would be paid, no country in Genghis Khan had ever received any compensation for colonialism, even after their independence in the later 20th century. And maybe to make things worse, for 2 centuries, many millions of the so-called Ethiopians had been enslaved and shipped to the Americas to work on the plantations as property of wealthy Chinese settlers. Based on scientific race theory, Genghis Khan's Ethiopians were seen as fit for physical labor only. A large part of the population had been forced to drudge in the coal mines. And while the coal was exported to fuel Chinese industrialization, Genghis Khan was left only with devastated crater landscapes and tens of millions of displaced people. In agriculture, the most fertile grounds were used not for feeding the local population, but for huge plantations of cash crops like apples and asparagus, exported to Asia to provide the breakfast tables with exotic fruits. Up until today, 70% of the land was owned by descendants of the Asian colonizers. And even after formal independence, probably our state was not really sovereign. Perhaps our first democratically elected socialist government, led by Willy Brandt, had been put down by a military coup orchestrated by some foreign secret service. Perhaps there would have been so many coups that someone had coined the term asparagus republic, a derogatory term, of course. And maybe we would have to pay back the debt accumulated by dictatorships established by such coups, like in South Africa or the DR Congo. And maybe a political intervention by the IMF in 1998 had prevented that a left-wing politician like Oscar Lafontaine had become a head of state, just like in South Korea at the time. Looking to the realm of culture, probably our best football players would be lured to the rich clubs of the major Asian leagues at an early age, where they would play maybe in the team of Shanghai, and they would be ridiculed by parts of the spectators because of their facial and body hair. Ronaldo and Lewandowski would be greeted by ape sounds in the stadium, and people would throw bananas at them. Many of the women in Genghis Khan would undergo cosmetic surgery in order not to be called long nose anymore. And probably our traditional cultural practices here in Genghis Khan would be considered backward and ridiculous, or even barbaric and misogynist, such as the Germanic tribal practice of dressing up young girls as so-called Tanzmariechen during the carnival season in costumes which deliberately reveal their underwear. In some areas, these practices were banned by law, of course. Talking about conflicts, Christian fundamentalists who try to achieve their religion's supremacy through violent means in Northern Ireland, who commit terrorist attacks against abortion clinics and their doctors in Georgia, who establish a Catholic state in the Vatican, or who defend the Christian Occident by mass murder in Norway, would be seen as representative for the Christian faith in general. Christians in Asia would constantly be challenged to renounce terrorism, Christian terrorism, and reject their backward religion. And although there had been no compensations paid for colonialism, Asian aid agencies would generously fund projects to develop the underdeveloped regions of Genghis Khan, sending experts with no knowledge of local languages and cultures, and supporting public-private partnerships with Asian corporations. And each year, legions of volunteers would come from China to Genghis Khan working in development aid, taking care, for example, of white orphans or fighting poverty, often without any qualification, apart from their origin in a developed country. And if the countries then remained poor, it probably was seen more as a question of a backward mentality and not a question of relations of power in neo-colonial globalized capitalism. And with this story of Genghis Khan, which might provide a new perspective on our reality, and which might illustrate the necessity of decolonizing development, I would hand back the microphone back to Julia Schöneberg, the chair of this cost action. Thank you.
Thanks, Aram, for so wonderfully highlighting the ridiculousness of it all and how much we actually take certain structures still for granted without questioning them. So I guess without much further ado, let us launch into the discussion, which will be on beyond lip service, imperatives and practical implications for decolonizing development. And as you've just highlighted, Aram, there's a dire need for doing so. So yes, first of all, we want to introduce our three panelists to you.
Okay, I will start with Olivia if you agree. Okay, so let me introduce you, Olivia Rutasibwa. She's a Belgian Rwandan international relations scholar and senior lecturer in European and International Development Studies at the University of Portsmouth and senior researcher fellow of the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Studies. Her research and teaching focuses on ways to decolonize international solidarity. Building on epistemic blackness in her research, she turns to recovering and reconnecting philosophies and practices of dignity, repair, and retreat in the post-colony to theorize solidarity anti-colonially. She recently was the co-editor of two books, the Routledge Handbook of Post-Colonial Politics with Robbie Shillian, and Decolonization and Feminism in Global Teaching and Learning with Sarah de Jong, and with another of the speakers this afternoon, Rosalba Icaza. And soon we'll have Olivia's non-academic monograph entitled The End of the White War, a Decolonial Manifesto. So thanks a lot, Olivia, for being today participating in our conversation. Julia?
Yeah, I would like to warmly welcome Rosalba Icaza, who is Associate Professor at the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, connected to Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and currently Rosalba is also visiting researcher at Leiden University. Before coming to the Netherlands, Rosalba was an activist in Mexico City and has worked for a network of social movements that has opposed the North American Free Trade Agreement. And Rosalba describes herself as a decolonial feminist, and while being trained in international relations, she's not circumscribed to a particular discipline anymore. With her research, she seeks to understand how place-based social resistances contribute to global epistemic justice. And in doing so, she looks at decolonial thinking and the international, learning as liberation and the liberation of learning, and thinking, academia, and promotion of autonomy. Rosalba is also a member of the transnational network of other knowledges, and she collaborates closely with the Universidad de la Tierra in Oaxaca, Mexico. Most recently, as Juan has already mentioned, she has co-edited together with Olivia and Sarah de Jong the volume on decolonization and feminism in global teaching and learning, which I very much recommend. And she has also published widely, most recently on Feminismos Decoloniales y Desarrollo. Welcome, Rosalba. Great to have you with us.
Okay, and the third speaker is Kalpana Wilson. She's a lecturer in geography at Birkbeck, University of London, and her research explores questions of race, gender, labor, neoliberalism, and reproductive rights and justice, with a particular focus on South Asia and its diasporas. In her recent research, Kalpana has explored the questions of racism and racialization in international development. She has examined the relationship between race, capital, embodiment, and resistance in transnational, historical, and contemporary contexts. In her work, she puts forward an approach which underlines the materiality of race in development, as well as its discursive aspects, combining elements of post-colonial critical race and feminist theory with political economy. As probably many of you know, Kalpana has published widely on race, gender, international development, women's agency, rural labor movements, and is the author of Race, Racism and Development, Interrogating History, Discourse and Practice. So thanks, Kalpana, for participating in the conversation. And Julia, if you want, I will introduce the first of the questions. Okay. So the first question, we have three main questions. The first one is quite general, but we found that it's central for our network. The question is, what is the problem with current development research, teaching, and practice? So maybe we could start, for example, with Olivia. Olivia, somewhere else you said that even in its most generous reading, the development aid sector, including departments of international development studies, is imbued by coloniality. So in this sense, in your opinion, what is the problem with development studies and more specifically with development research, Olivia?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm actually really happy to be here, especially because I've been thinking about this question for a while, along many different iterations. Maybe we don't always use the label decolonizing, but I think we're gaining a critical mass of people that feel or finally listen to the instinctive understanding that there is something radically or profoundly wrong with something about development aid, studies, practices, whatever. And I think there's many traditions amongst other post-development studies that have attended to that. So we also don't have to pretend that we're starting from point zero. To engage with the question, and I think maybe it's a bit colored by what I've been reading lately, but also maybe something that you mentioned in your introduction, how I think I'm more and more trying to connect my engagement with maybe Black radical thought or the Black experience, and I have a quite wide definition of that. So this is not about identity politics, but and how that actually is not always necessarily a better or more acute way of understanding things, but I am, and that's maybe the first point I want to make, I think we need to attend to the necessity to save time. And that's connected to what I said before. Post-development is a conversation that's been going on for at least 40 years, right? Post-colonial thought as well, anti-colonialism as well. And I think somewhere in colonial science, we're always pushed to pretend that we're inventing something new and that, new kids on the block and everybody's super happy with this new label now. Even institutions are going to jump on that. But the point I want to make here, I think, is maybe epistemologically even more profound, is that I'm trying to investigate what makes it that we even get away with always reproducing this logic of newness, right? And so what I found recently, and it was by re-engaging with work by James Baldwin and people that have commented on his work, like Eddie Glaude, where how much time would we save if we just called development as something attached to a lie, a deep lie? And that's not just development, but, let's say the lie of neoliberal capitalism, whatever, right? Because I think maybe the last 20 years of my life, I've spent mostly on deconstructing the lie, but it's a lie that we all know. And it's the same lie we know when it comes to racism and all of that, right? So, and to be more specific in this case, what the lie that is being brought up by both James Baldwin and Eddie Glaude is the lie of maybe the institutionalized value gap, the gap in value of human lives, the differentiations that we make, but maybe not just human life, but life in general. And I think that allows us to have a conversation about sentient beings and life in general beyond just the trope of the human that is obviously quite problematic. So then the invitation is to think to what extent does development research, development practices contribute to the reproduction of that lie and the institutions that need that lie to be continued, rather than what supposedly explicitly development is about, which is about saving lives. And so I do think, and I guess my invitation would be this, to stop pretending that development as a discourse and a practice has been at the service of life. It's been the opposite, and that's the lie. And I think if we attended to that from the beginning, and again, it's an understanding that comes, for instance, from Black radical thought, where the whole of the American society is being built around this lie of the value gap, and all the institutions around it are part of that. Part of those institutions is investing deeply into white innocence. And I think development studies, development practices is so much to do about innocence, where we try to cancel out everything that happened in the past. We drop into the present, and then somehow we say, let us be nice and help you. And I know I'm butchering a lot of the details of what's actually happening in development studies, but I know these are the types of desires that bring my particular students in my particular classroom, just as an example, but also why people apply to work for the UN or whatever. It's not malice necessarily, but it's the lie of innocence as well to some extent. So that, I would say, the first thing is let's try to attend to the lie, because that helps us very quickly as a shortcut. A shortcut, even maybe that would not need us to go to an imagined Genghis-Khan to understand what's going on, because in a way we know it, right? So what happens when we continually have to attend to a wide imaginary of the world in which we still need to re-explain that it's built on a lie? And the other point that I want to make, but I'll do it in the rest of the some of the other questions, but I want to mention it so that I don't forget it. But I think once we attend to the lie, I think it's also really important to attend to the evil of the desire of mastery that is also deeply embedded in the whole of development practices and thinking. That even with the best of intentions, the thing that drives us is that we have not had an honest conversation about how we can organize power distribution differently and fight against our own desires to reproduce a particular type of mastery, whether that's in material sense or whether that is in terms of cognitive empire, as some people have called it. So that would be my first ideas. The problem with development is that it's a lie. And it sounds quite cynical, but I think that's what I want to say in this first round.
Julia?
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. I want to ask, connecting to what you just said, the idea, what you just mentioned in terms of reproductive mastery and the cognitive empire, and that obviously especially of institutions of higher education in which many of us are working, are buying into these promises. And we are having degrees of international development studies where people are trained to become developers, essentially. So I want to ask Rosala, I want to ask you, obviously there has been widespread calls to decolonize the university. So in terms of reproducing, in terms of the ways knowledge is taught, is conveyed, is created in institutions of higher education in universities, what you think is the problem there?
Thank you, Julia, and also thank you for being the second one, because then I'm inspired by what Olivia has just mentioned. I think that there might be more agreements than disagreements in this round table, but anyway, in order to answer your question, Julia, I really need to situate it. Maybe I'm going to speak about higher education, but it's actually informed by research that I have conducted in 2016, actually with the author of White Innocence as a chair of that commission, Professor Gloria Becker. And together we did some research about the state of demographic diversity and epistemic plurality in University of Amsterdam, one of the oldest universities in the Netherlands and perhaps Europe, I don't know. But it's also informed, what I have to say about these problems is also informed by a long-term, let's say, coalitional work with indigenous peoples in Aviala, their struggles for autonomy, self-determination, and also their projects, the Land University, the pluriversities in the south of Mexico. So from that perspective and situated in this particular, or in this set of particular experiences, I think that there is no one single problem. There are many problems about how knowledge is taught in institutions of higher education. And I think that I can briefly point at 4 of these problems. The first problem is that, and I think that Olivia has already a little bit touched on that, is that higher education as we know it now and as we practice within it, is that it denies its origins. Higher education is a consequence of the expansion of European modernizing project. Like national states and capitalism. And this origin has been constantly covered up by normative claims that higher education is actually a positive common good. So that is the main, well, not the main, but one of the problems that I can actually put on the table. The second one, and related to this cover-up, is that higher education is implicated in epistemicide. It's actively implicated in the destruction of life and worlds. So the expansion of higher education, as I said, is implicated in the erasure of plural worlds of knowledge. And from my point of view, unfortunately, in our teaching, we still are failing to address that erasure. And this is a common pattern that I have found in research, not only in the social sciences, but across many other differences, not only in development studies. So the third problem that I can think about higher education is that teaching is actually close to plurality. And at least in the way it is organized now, higher education is close to a genuine knowledge plurality. And this sounds, I know, counterintuitive when universities, especially here in the global north, are defended as beacons of academic freedom. So what I'm trying to say here is that I'm not promoting, let's say, an approach that is against expertise. But what I'm trying to say is that a genuine approach to knowledge that is open is an approach that is geo-historically positioned in forms of expertise. So it's not floating anywhere. That's what I started by situating what I was about to say. And the fourth problem that is related to these other three is that teaching in higher education has failed to this promotion or this encouragement of geo-historically positioning forms of knowledge. And with this, I mean that the way we transmit knowledge is produced by research that is not positioned. And often this research actually contributes to occlude instead of revealing the geo and body political of the knowledge that we are teaching. So indeed, teachers who do position the knowledge they are teaching are actually often disencouraged and rarely supported to do this kind of work because it's distracting them from what is supposed to be transmitted to students. So I think that in sum, higher education deny origins, the implication in epistemicide, its closure to knowledge plurality, and the lack of geo-historical positioning are some of the main problems that we are facing. And perhaps in the rest of the intervention, I can share a little bit of how, from a decolonial, more specifically a feminist decolonial position, we have been working in higher education to actually address some of these problems.
Thanks, Rosalba. And of course, we we want to go further and hear a little bit more about the approaches to tackle this. And of course, this is also a question we will approach a little bit later. Is of course the geopolitical dimension also of this particular network, and obviously also the fact that we're speaking all English in this event, and in several of our institutions we're teaching in English and we're reading English texts. So of course that also has huge implications in terms of which knowledge is conveyed and is taught. So Kalpana, obviously, we have divided it into like research, teaching and practice, but it can't be divided, as we've just also seen. But I want to ask you, since you've also researched on the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, and obviously they have claimed that to be all-inclusive, being transformative for everyone, leaving no one behind. So I want to ask you, what are the most obvious blind spots in current development practices? You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, no. Thank you, Julia. I'm very excited for this discussion and also for the launch of the network. And in a way, what I've said, I think, coming third, it's obviously, I'm going to be repeating much of what's already been said. I don't know if I would really look at it in terms of blind spots, but more in a way in terms of, if we're talking about development practice, what do we really mean and how do we question the structures in which these development practices are really embedded? Because when I would talk about international development, and I think this very much echoes things which Olivia said, we're talking about this whole complex of unequal and oppressive and extractive material relationships and processes, which have structured the engagement between, for want of a better term, the global south and the global north. And also, of course, we're talking about the development then becoming the way in which we understand these relationships, this overwhelming discursive framework, which, what Olivia referred to as the lie. And I think, again, as Rosalba said, we can't think of development unless we think about the operations of global capital. And it has to be understood in relation to imperialism in particular, rather than as an alternative which somehow renders imperialism invisible, which is what tends to happen in discourses about development. So I think when we talk about sustainable development, we need to first of all question what is actually sought to be sustained in the Sustainable Development Agenda and the SDGs. Because if we look at the approaches which underpin the SDGs, as many people have pointed out, sustainable development is really about finding ways of sustaining these enormous racialized global inequalities. And whereas earlier you had the development institutions sort of talking about how their goals were eradicating poverty, they talked about catching up with the West, which of course was hugely problematic in so many ways, which has been talked about by, as we've heard, by post-development theories, for example, for many decades. But now this is no longer the language, this is no longer the shape that the lie takes. Instead, they're openly seeking to make this poverty and inequality sustainable by shifting the responsibility onto those who experience it. And it's become explicitly about sustaining the security and shoring up the borders of the global north, preventing people from moving, while continuing processes of accumulation and extraction from the global south. It's about sustaining economic growth, for which, of course, we can read capitalist profits, while the global south continues to bear the brunt of climate change. And then, of course, we know that sustainable development is also deeply infused with Malthusian and eugenicist ideas, in which population growth in the global south, which for decades was already constructed as the cause of poverty, now also comes to be seen as a cause of things like climate change, migration, terrorism, and many other things. So the other thing I wanted to say at this point briefly was that if we're thinking about a decolonial approach materially, we have to understand not only the past, but we also have to understand that we're right now in the midst of a new wave of colonialism of a particular form, with corporate land grab, the extraction of people's labor and people's knowledge, particularly, of course, from sub-Saharan Africa. And one way this is happening is through the global development initiatives like the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition, like the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, which, in the name, and it's in this kind of name of fighting hunger, now it's promoting climate smart agriculture. these initiatives are actually forcibly transferring land to corporates for export crops like palm oil and biofuels, and using the same old racist colonial myths that the land is empty. They're compelling changes to seed laws, which mean that indigenous agricultural knowledge is both criminalized and at the same time appropriated. They're requiring people to use chemical fertilizers and pesticides, which we know cause harms amounting to slow death. And at the same time, again, the people being targeted for this plunder of their land, labor, and knowledge continue to be represented as the perpetual recipients of aid from the North in ways which, of course, we know are deeply colonial and racialized. And I think before I finish this part, because I know we have other questions to move on to, I just want to say that we need to recognize when we're talking about decolonizing who some of the powerful new colonial actors are. We need to look, for example, at the so-called philanthrocapitalists like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is incredibly powerful now, not only in their development interventions, but also in funding research, also in funding media, which looks at development. They're in the spotlight right now for their very central role in the global regime of vaccine inequality and apartheid in the context of COVID-19. And we can also see their ongoing role in population policies, within which you've got racialized women being seen as dangerous reproductive bodies marked by excessive fertility, which needs to be managed and controlled. So finally, I'd just like to say on this point that when we're talking about decolonizing, I think we need to, remember the histories, but we also need to talk about settler colonialism as something which isn't only in the past, something which is happening now. So particularly, of course, we need to look at Israel as a contemporary existing apartheid state, and we need to actively stand with the Palestinian people in their ongoing struggle against colonialism. And we need to also be aware of other states which are learning from and modeling themselves on this. For example, India and Kashmir, where a long-term military occupation is now adopting settler colonial strategies, very much modeled on what Israel is doing. So yeah, I mean, as I said, a lot to discuss, so I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, definitely a lot to discuss, and thank you also for very much highlighting and emphasizing the dimension of or the role of global capitalism and that, and the very material dimension, whereas obviously very often development is depicted as something very sanitized and very neutral and very normatively good, that is just working to help and to create a better life for everyone. Yeah, and I think as you highlighted and as Tuk and Yang have written this their article about decolonizing is not a metaphor, very much also emphasizing that decolonization also has a very material dimension in terms of the repatriation of land, in terms of reparations. So yeah, I mean, I also, if you want to, feel free if you want to, comment on each other. We don't have to do it like a one-dimensional conversation. So.
Also, Julia, I would like to remind the audience they can use Slido, because so far we have very interesting ideas. Probably people they want to ask some questions. We have Slido, so please type there your questions, so later we can ask them to the speakers.
Yeah, there's so many aspects that are coming up that we will need to follow up on later. So obviously now we've mapped a little bit of the the huge injustices and of the problems. So we want to talk a little bit about what can be done and what should be done. Olivia, you talked, and you all talked about also the importance of epistemic justice and the need to diversify knowledges. So how can we make sure that our efforts to diversify knowledge, production, teaching, whatever, go beyond the simple lip service or window dressing? You have written about decoloniality as a research strategy, but as Rosalba has also highlighted, obviously research institutions are also very much institutionalized in certain ways. So as researchers, how do we go about pursuing decoloniality as a research strategy?
Thank you. I was invited, how many years ago is it now? 3 years, 4 years, by Rosalba to speak at her institution. And it was about epistemic diversity. And I think that really allowed me to articulate that in the particular situatedness of Europeans waking up to decolonizing, and I include myself in that, maybe we should, I know I'm using a lot of platitudes, but as I said, I'm a bit obsessed about how much time we're wasting sometimes. But I think maybe we should really move away stealthily from words like inclusion and diversity, because we're butchering them and we're using them literally to keep everything exactly the same, right? And so, let me complicate that and say something slightly more analytically sound. But I think if I were to combine the comments I heard by Kalpana and Rosalba, I think that's the best way to illustrate it. On the one hand, there are things happening in the worldwide that all concern us, but might concern us in different and unequal ways, unequal in the sense of how we position ourselves towards them, right? So the reminder of settler colonialism, and obviously the struggles of the Palestinian people, but then all the different ways, technologies in which the Israeli occupation is being reproduced everywhere in the world. I think that's a general human community concern that we've had with us since 1492, let's say, again, in a Western context in which we can think of it until the present, right? What I mean with an unequal positionality to that, and that's where I pick up with Rosalba, always reminding us that we speak from a particular situatedness. Speaking of positionality is something that in white Western feminism, we've seen being abused as a way to recenter the conversation about our feelings, our positions. Oh my God, am I allowed to say this? Fake censorship and all of that. But I think the more profound imperative there is to engage with this thing about mastery, right? So we invoke where we speak from, not to then in the next sentence show either, I think to some extent, sometimes either fake humility or to reproduce a particular mastery in terms of, we should all be worried because China is the next imperial power in Africa, for instance, right? And that's, I think, sometimes is really the rock and the hard place thing, because again, depending on where you're speaking from, even me being of African descent, and specifically from Rwanda, speaking from a Western positionality, depending on who I'm speaking to, but China might not be the first actor I bring up to try and engage coloniality in Africa today. But that does not mean that I would not, as a student rather than as an expert, engage in learning from my colleagues from the continent in the way they're trying to unpack this new form or new manifestation of the liar imperialism, right? And I think that for me is if we invoke diversity, if we're not willing to do the work of dislocating the power when it comes to this, the cognitive empire, epistemic freedom, it's again reproducing this lie as if there is a point zero from which we can engage in knowledges, and then it's just up to And I think when I went to Rosabas, I called it the Benetton move, where it's just about just adding color, just adding other diversity, and it looks nice because we're doing something, right? But that is status quo. So I think a lot of our concerns, if we are willing to answer the question to what extent power has been dislocated, and to what extent we have attended to probably the lie of racial colonial capitalism, then I think it's from there that I'm very suspicious about a lot of our talk, the actual institutional talks about inclusion and diversity, but also how we can see how even the language of decoloniality is being co-opted in that. And then concretely in the classroom, when I invoke a decolonial research strategy, I think also there are a million ways in which that can be done, and a lot of people have done it in really great ways. In my undergraduate class, I invite students to engage with different levels of, and I even call it storytelling, let's say, but how do we engage with ontological questions of how the world works? There, I invite them to think about the mythology of most of our disciplines, like what is the thing that is being reproduced? Where do we start the story? The mythology of Eurocentrism, but also how there is a deep fragmentation in our storytelling about the world. And then secondly, also to engage with epistemology, obviously, like where do we get our knowledges from, but also what do we consider legitimate knowledge? And there also, we've narrowed it down to the tiny minority on planet Earth, but also a tiny expression of knowing, which is the so-called rational thought that is not even rational. It isn't even, right? But it's packaged as such. But then very much also the things that Kapana focuses on is certainly, like, on the one hand, the normative question, like why do we even engage in certain storytellings, but how is it connected to what matters, right? It matters as both importance, but also materiality. And that allows us to think of political economy in over the long durée, I think. So that's really like briefly, but I can offer this here, but it's just one of the million ways in which people have engaged in decoloniality as a research strategy. But if it's not accompanied with an attending to mastery, then all of this is just a reproduction of the same coloniality. And that has been, I think, again, it's nothing new. But it's the way in which a neoliberal colonial logic reproduces itself through some of our most potentially radical concepts that people have come up with in the most challenging circumstances. But then somehow it ends up being neutralized. And I think that's one thing I would say for especially a European network on decolonizing anything. That should be like really at the center of our concerns, not as paralyzing things saying, oh, we're in Europe, we can't do anything. No, we actually have huge responsibilities, but pushing back against the re-entrenchment of a particular mastery, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. Rosalba, as I was listening to Olivia speaking, for example, about epistemic freedom, I remember that in your research and your activist work, you understand learning as liberation. So in your previous intervention, you were like highlighting some of the problems we find in development teaching. And in this sense, in your opinion, what does a feminist and decolonial politics of knowing and learning look like?
Thank you, Juan. Yes, actually, I think that I can explain a little bit of what I mean by learning as liberation, and also try to address a little bit of what Olivia was talking about. I think that to a certain extent, liberate learning is one way in which many of us are trying to transcend the lies, or the lie, if you want to speak about it in singular. But it's also a strategy and a way of understanding our world that is deeply situated, and of course, this is very important to mention. What I want to elaborate as this idea of learning as liberation and the politics that is behind it is, of course, needs to be in relation to this challenge that Tu and Yang since the beginning articulate very clearly, and that I have found everywhere I work to build up coalitional work in Aviala. And this idea that when we talk about decolonization is not a metaphor. I was just 5 minutes ago, 1 hour ago, I was in a discussion about astronomy and how enlightened a group of scholars of color are trying to decolonize astronomy. And their point of departure is that many of the sites where the astronomical sites are being located in Chile, Southeast Asia, and so forth are actually indigenous lands. So when I'm thinking about liberation or learning as liberation, I'm not only thinking about the epistemological, I'm actually thinking about these concrete struggles. But now, as an academic or as a decolonial feminist within higher education in the global north, that is a tiny, tiny, tiny nothingness in relation to the rest of the struggles that we can try to support and be part of. I need to unpack what I mean by that in order to later on explain you what are the politics behind this learning as liberation. And let me start with another story. Also, Olivia talked about how she teaches and how she brings these questions that you are formulating in her classroom. I have the story of a panel in which I was involved in January this year in Amsterdam. And I was the chair of that panel, and all the speakers were women of color who work in the field of development studies as researchers, mentors, practitioners, teachers, no? And something that was very interesting for me is that we started by articulating our point of departure as one that takes the field of development studies as unsafe for dialogue and unsafe for learning each other, as Jackie Alexander is constantly inviting women of color to do. We also articulate this idea that it's very important for us that we, as Olivia has already mentioned, women of color is not an identity. It's actually a coalitional term, as Maria Lugones constantly invites us to think about it. And it's precisely from that positionality of a coalitional term, a coalitional possibility, that we started to discuss development as a term that is actually articulating what in the colonial thinking practice we describe as what articulates the modern colonial divide, or in other words, development works. And I have already repeat this several times, but I think that is important, that development functions to articulate the separation between those who consume the life of others and of Earth and those who are consumed. So that is our point of departure and why it's so unsafe as women of color to talk in this field. And we also articulate something that we call the coloniality of development as 3 losses or as 3 silences. And I'm talking about this because, believe me, this is what is grounding this learning as liberation. One of these losses is what has been conceptualized as the loss of worlds of meaning or worldlessness. The other loss that we were actually talking about is the loss of the relation to Earth or earthlessness. And the third one is the loss of our capacity of contextual and enfleshed knowledge or knowing or enfleshlessness. These are the losses that we actually articulate and call the coloniality of development. And as decolonial feminists, our politics of knowing has as a political horizon the liberation of learning from these losses, from this coloniality. So we're not starting from nowhere. We're starting from a very, very concrete understanding of the losses, painful losses. So our task, and this is what we concluded in this panel, is that we want to nurture a learning that unmutes, and using Olivia's terminology, de-silences worlds of meaning that grounds us in places where we call home, because some of us are really diasporic or peregrinas, as we say in Spanish, pilgrimages in different places, and that help us to recover the capacity of relation with others and with earth, and especially with life. So in this kind of conversation, we also came to realize that we find a lot of inspiration for articulating these losses and this horizon of from where we have to liberate our politics of knowledge from women who are not feminist, but that are actively engaged resisting patriarchal, racist, colonial projects of death of capitalism. So this is basically what is the horizon behind this politics of knowledge. If you ask me how it specifically looks or how I actually characterize it, I will say that it's a politics that is hopeful, that affirms resistencia or reexistence in English, that is recentering in listening and coalition, but perhaps I can develop these characteristics in relation to what this network actually can do as interested in undoing coloniality in the next set of questions.
Yeah, thanks, Rosalba. That was already very, very rich and very, obviously, yeah, that brings me. Well, you emphasized obviously this resistance, this active resistance against racist and patriarchal structures. And Kalpana, you've also in your work called for a re-centering of race. So if we, in our context, what would a truly anti-racist stance on practice look like?
I think in a way I'm very much reminded of what Olivia said at the beginning about newness, and the kind of the desire to, on the one hand, always be saying new, but also the desire, the claim to innocence of not having heard any of this before, when in fact it's been said for such a very long time. And I think one of the paradoxes, particularly when we come to talk about racism in development, is that there is always this perpetual sense of it's something new, which hasn't been talked about before. We're always told when we talk about it that it's somehow eye-opening. And yet, we know it's almost a century since W.E.B. Du Bois talked about the global color line, for example. It's almost 50 years since Walter Rodney, the Guyanese Marxist scholar and activist, wrote How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which, of course, brilliantly explains the whole how European capitalism was built on the profits of Atlantic slavery and colonialism, and how at the same time it was inextricable from those processes of extraction, destruction, and dispossession in Africa. So, this is not something in any way new on one level. When we're talking about development practice, I think what has happened now, and this relates to what people have been saying about the kind of, appropriation of these critical questions. It's increasingly we're seeing, development organizations saying that they want to look at how to develop anti-racist practice within their organizations. And of course, on one level, that's extremely important because day-to-day experiences of racism for people who work in these organizations are absolutely endemic. But what happens is that it's very dangerous to separate that from the way in which these organizations themselves are embedded in wider racist and imperialist global structures and the way they perpetuate them. So in a way, when we're looking at anti-racist practice, I thought it might be more useful to look, outside of those frameworks of development, and to look at how that might, the kinds of movements which are actually kind of engaging with these questions. And of course, recently we've had the Black Lives Matter movement. And particularly if we look at the protests which took place in 2020, and I'm based in the UK, so I'm looking at that. We can see how these connections which we need to be making between racism and contemporary global coloniality, imperialism, were really very central to the practices of those who were protesting in those movements. The fact that they targeted the statues of slave traders and of colonial white supremacists like Rhodes and Churchill in Britain reflects in a way the way the movement was actually linking the murderous police racism in North America and Europe with how the violence of race and white supremacy has been historically and remains today embedded in global structures of capital accumulation. And one thing which I think has been particularly striking about the BLM protests in Europe has been the particular focus on the racialized violence of borders. And the fact that the people who commemorated, included those who have been murdered during deportations or in the custody of immigration officers or by drowning at sea. And as I said, we need to think about how development is now explicitly geared to shoring up these borders which repeatedly kill, containing people within the global south, preventing people from moving, while of course allowing resources and profits to freely move to the global north. And of course, these are processes in which we must remember that states and dominant classes in the global south also frequently collude. And again, here I wanted to give one example of how connections are made in practice in spaces of protest. Because one of the most recent Black Lives Matter protests in London in October 2020 took place in solidarity with the wave of mass protests in Nigeria against the brutality of the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, the SARS, which is, as you may know, it's a notorious unit of the Nigerian police. And as the scope of the protest in Nigeria widened beyond the demand to abolish SARS or end SARS, protesters in the UK, too, many of whom were young British members of the Nigerian diaspora, started highlighting the oppressive structures and the class character of the post-colonial Nigerian state and linking the violence of the state to British colonial history. And also the ongoing British training to those police units. They linked this violence to the contemporary interdependence with oil companies like Shell and Chevron and their continuing imperialist plunder. So these kinds of interventions and these kind of connections which are already being made are ones which I feel we should urgently engage with. We need to be engaging with the questions and demands which are emerging from abolitionist politics, from reparationist politics, from anti-imperialist revolutionary politics. And we also need to remember that if we're talking about, challenges to development, these are already happening, as Rosalba said. But really, outside of many of the labels like feminism, as she said, and certainly outside the institutional frameworks of development, they're happening in social and political movements. And one of the things which I think we have a duty to do is to amplify these. For example, right now, I'm sure lots of people know, perhaps one of the biggest protests in history is taking place in India with the farmers' protests against laws which will hand over agriculture to corporate agribusiness. Now, on the one hand, this is about countering the Indian state under Narendra Modi, which is a far-right Hindu supremacist state. It's also an ideology which appropriates decolonial rhetoric, and that's something which I can talk about later if people are interested. It's also deeply implicated in anti-Blackness, reflecting this whole question of the complexity of the kind of coalitions which can and can't be made. But the farmers' movement is essentially resisting new laws which are introduced by this government, which benefit powerful Indian corporates, and those Indian corporates are also a very significant element now in global capital. But the new laws are also more broadly about these questions of global imperialism. They'll undermine India's food sovereignty and essentially opening it up as a dumping ground for the food grains which are produced in the global north. The World Trade Organization is insisting on the removal of minimum support prices, while huge subsidies on farming in Europe and North America are allowed to continue. So these become questions for anyone who has a kind of critical concern with the kind of questions we're talking about. And what's interesting is that the spaces of these protests are also spaces of contestation of all kinds of relationships around gender, around caste, around class, and are starting to question extractive models of agriculture and of building new alliances. So I think it's very important that we kind of realize that we are in a position to amplify those voices because of our location, and that is not only we're in a position to, but it becomes a responsibility.
Okay, thank you very much, Kalpana. A lot of elements to think about. Julia, do you think we should go for the third question, or?
Yeah, I think Kalpana basically already brought us there in terms of what to do.
Okay, so I will introduce the third question, and let's continue thinking and speaking. Okay, the third question is quite general too, but we thought it was essential for the new challenge we have with this network. And the question focuses on the fact that we are a European network on decolonizing development, which somehow could be understood as a kind of contradiction, because historically, but nowadays too, Europe is the epicenter of colonialism, and also because the network is mostly formed, let's say, by privileged academics from the global north. So in that sense, many people could understand it as a kind of contradiction, as I said. For example, Leon Musavi recently cautioned on the dangers of enacting colonization instead of dismantling it, or as Rosalba was mentioning before, there is also the risk of understanding colonization exclusively as a metaphor. However, on the other hand, a European network on decolonizing development, I'm sure it also opens opportunities for learning, for exchanging ideas and experiences, and for promoting change. Otherwise, I think we wouldn't be here today. So we have some hope that we can produce something. So the question is, and in this case, I think it's fair starting with Kalpana, because previously we were always following the same order. So Kalpana, what do you think a European network on decolonizing development can and cannot do, and should and shouldn't do?
Okay, well, that's probably the biggest question here. And you've just heard me talking quite a bit, but since the order has been reversed, now you're going to hear me again. Anyway, I do think that this whole question of appropriation is a very big danger. And I think, we're all kind of probably some of us, certainly depending on where we're located, are experiencing that attempt to kind of in universities to have some diversity initiatives, which, and Olivia has talked about them, and now suddenly they're getting relabeled as decolonizing, and this is hugely a huge danger, which we need to avoid, colluding with. And I think more broadly, this particularly in this era of neoliberalism, I think neoliberal discourses are particularly good at appropriating terms and transforming their meaning, making them, for example, about individual behavior rather than about structures of power. And we've seen this happen a lot with feminism, of course. And the way in which that has been kind of, certain strands of feminism have been mobilized to basically intensify the exploitation of women's labor, incorporate them into global labor markets, and so on. And we are seeing this happening with decolonizing. It's become a buzzword too for the big international development NGOs, which remain completely embedded in the extractive structures we're talking about. And it's also been a strategy, from my point of view, for the British state, for a very, very long time. Its response to whole waves of anti-racist organizing, for example, was to bring in so-called multiculturalism, to bring in racial awareness training, So it's about depoliticizing, dividing, and trying to undermine. But I think equally importantly, we do need to recognize that we're also seeing at the moment a real polarization with the rise of the far right. And I'm not talking only about far right organizations, but far right states. So actually, very often those who use these terms are being actively demonized in many countries in Europe. So just a few days ago, here in the UK, we had the spectacle of a government minister, the universities minister, talking about how initiatives to decolonize the curriculum are equivalent to what she called Soviet Union style censorship, right? And we've seen similar attacks on critical race theory in parliament by the ruling Conservative Party. In France, very recently we saw Macron launching the attack on the so-called Islamo-leftist academics in universities, right? And very often, as we know, these attacks are weaponizing the notion of freedom of speech in ways which have become all too familiar, where powerful voices who express dominant views which justify oppression and exploitation are presented as being persecuted or silenced. And in a way, these are often very thinly veiled attacks on the very presence of scholars and students of color within academia. So I think we need to recognize that this is the kind of terrain in which this initiative we have here is now operating, in which it actually becomes more important than ever to have a network like this, which can act in solidarity when such attacks happen. I mean, in terms of what is and isn't possible, that's something which I think is really here for the discussion which we're going to have with all of us. But one thing I would like to perhaps suggest is that rather than seeking to define what is decolonial and what decolonial futures might look like, which is really a project of the colonized, and which, as people have said, is already happening, and it's not within our control, nor should it be, right? It's something which is already happening. So that's not the role of this network, clearly. I think what, in a way, the role of a network like this based in Europe is to be actively anti-colonial, to recognize and expose imperialism in what's been called, the belly of the beast, the headquarters of the development institutions, of the corporates, of the banks. They're all here. And to recognize and challenge, the continuing flow of resources and wealth, the destruction, the dispossession which accompanies this, the kind of devaluing of life in all its forms, as people have said. And this means, of course, also taking on those policies which appear progressive and redistributed, which take these flows and these inequalities for granted, whether it's in terms of climate policies or social policies, those which kind of are built on rather than challenging these global inequalities, what Olivia calls the lie. And I completely agree, as we've said that, and as Tuck and Yang have written, that decolonization cannot just be seen as a metaphor. We know that universities across Europe are built on the profits of slavery at the root of colonialism. We had Rhodes Must Fall. We had many other movements demonstrating this very viscerally. But they're also being sustained through contemporary material relations of imperialism. So in this context, things like divestment from fossil fuels and extractive industries by universities becomes important. The boycott, divestment and sanctions BDS movement in relation to Israel becomes very important. Resisting the violence of bordering, for example, through the policing of international students and staff, becomes very important. And also, of course, the university as a space of exploitation of the labor of racialized workers. So, for example, here in the UK, there have been a series of struggles by cleaners, by porters, and by other workers who are precarious and subcontracted for recognition and rights. These workers are overwhelmingly people of color. Many of them are precarious migrants. So active solidarity with these struggles is really key to making this an anti-colonial project. And then, as I said, the making visible of movements which are beyond the borders of Europe, which are taking place outside of the framework of development in any form, and which really envision a multiplicity of different futures.
Okay, thank you, Carvana. Rosalba, Olivia, would you like to share any comment, any idea, your own answer?
I don't think that I can say more than what Kalpana. I totally agree with what you say, that perhaps the most important thing that we can do is to be explicitly anti-colonial, because by being explicitly anti-colonial, then we can be explicitly anti-extractivist, both in terms of the research we do and in terms of the means we use that are deeply implicated in how we're depleting Earth and the life of others. So yes, count me on that. I think that this is very important. I'm also concerned of what is happening with the decolonial. I always mention this to Olivia. 10 years ago, when I really started to be a student of decoloniality, nobody was speaking about it. And I left my disciplinary background, international relations, very frustrated because nobody was understanding what was the potential of coloniality, of the notion of coloniality of power and coloniality of gender. And 10 years later, I'm like, it's everywhere. And that is extremely problematic. And actually, I'm writing now a piece with an ISS PhD researcher, Suleika Sheikh, and we're calling this piece Decolonial Catfish. And actually, what we are doing in this piece is examining through very concrete examples of recent publications how the appropriation of decolonial voices and scholars is presented as new, innovative critiques to fields, which is extremely problematic, or to disciplines. But it's also very painful because many of our colleagues are actually using the decolonial as a new participatory. And it's frustrating, and sometimes we spend a lot of time trying to understand how this started, why this started, but also we are very clear that this is a noise and a distraction, and that we have to also be concerned in doing other kind of work. And this is, at least, again, very much situated as a decolonial feminist, what I think can be my contribution to this network. Something that I'm already constantly asking in the working group on teaching, decolonizing teaching, is that we constantly have to be asking ourselves, decolonizing development, what for? what actually why are we doing this? What we want to undo coloniality or be explicitly anti-colonial through this network. I think that this is not only important but ethical, that we need to constantly be asking ourselves. I don't have an answer, but I can see that the power of asking why we are doing this kind of work is very important. I also know that given the parameters of a project like this, and as a decolonial feminist, is quite difficult. It's quite difficult to do this work because not everybody is carrying the same burden or is not positioned equally to carry the burdens that are associated with the task of decolonizing development. And this is something that I want to stress again. I think that I have already mentioned it, but I think that it's not enough to constantly being critical about with whom we are working and how in many of the institutional settings that we are working, we're actually depending on casualized work, as Kalpana was just mentioning, and how many of the people who is doing the work, for example, of addressing how canons in the discipline are actually implicated in coloniality and its reproduction is actually being carried out by precarized, non-tenure, PhDs, people of color who are very much invested in this kind of work. So I think that as a network, besides being explicitly anti-colonial, I think that we also need to be very, concerned about how we can protect these students. Yeah, that was my son. These people that we have been working with. I think that we cannot avoid this. As we cannot avoid to be explicitly anti-colonial, we cannot avoid to be very concerned that this is the people with whom we are doing this work, and we cannot walk away from this. I also think that we have a lot of work to do to listen. I know that this sounds very corny and everybody's talking about deep listening and these kind of things, but really as a network of European-based scholars, I think that we need to be more quiet. And I'm speaking, but I really think that we need to be much more quiet. I think that if our interest is to, again, to use Olivia's terminology, if our interest is to de-silence worlds of meanings that have been produced by the institutional logics as non-existent, then we really need to be very silent. Now, the question is that how we do this. And again, my thinking when you sent this question was that one of the tasks that I see in these kind of networks, that I celebrate that they exist, because I most of the time work through networks and through coalitions. I understand that as a woman of color, working in an European environment, I cannot do anything alone. I really need to work coalitionally. Also to survive the institutional settings in which we are, most of us, based. So yes, it's coalitional. It's important that we are doing this kind of network, but it's deeply insufficient. And I think that one of the tasks that I would like to contribute and invite others to contribute is also to mark the limits of this movement. I think that Kalpana has already do it very clearly what I was trying to say. By being an European-based network that is pushing for the decolonization of development, we need to also understand that this comes from a very specific epistemic territory, and this is the epistemic territory of modernity. And we are very much invested in ways of speaking about it, languages, English, colonial, Spanish, that are colonial, and that therefore mark the limits of what we are actually doing. And we need to be very conscious about that, because for many people, engaging with this network is actually hurtful, because you have to actually speak through languages, through means of validation that are actually complicit in their own dehumanization and their own erasure. So we also have to be aware of this. It's very specific what we are doing in the, let's say, cosmology of struggles of resistance and struggles, anti-capitalist struggles, anti-colonial struggles that some of us are part of. So I will just leave it like that.
Thanks, Rosalba. Olivia, I'm sure that you need to share some ideas because we have a lot of elements and I'm sure you are just waiting, so go on.
To follow on that is I'm actually grateful. I know I often think in terms of like, it's not even buzzwords, but it helps me, especially when things present themselves as complex and multifaceted, whatever, to like turn back to certain words. But as I also like to remind, the words in themselves are a bit random, right? So I wouldn't say let's have our network, build around these things, but just to, I guess, to bring some clarity in the chaos that's momentarily in my head. I will try to engage with what does a European network needs to attend to. Let's call it that. First of all, by already complicating what that European might mean. And I think on the one hand, let's call it the deep entrenched whiteness of that Europeanness, but then also remember that that's not all that European is, right? Like everybody on this call already, all the colors of the rainbow, different positionalities. Many of us, I'm not going to say everyone, but we are in one or the other way engaged within that Europe. But I do think that it is extremely important, especially on the individual, institutional level, to fight against this white innocence thing, right? And for an engagement with the whiteness of development, the thing that we want to decolonize in a white European context. And I hope it's clear, I'm not just talking about phenotype here, but let's say the modernity thing that, was offered. I think it's extremely important to engage with ideas of abolition and ideas of repair. And for me, like to then answer the question about what is it that we want to decolonize for, and maybe that's something where I do think that post-development thought has given us so much of all the elements, but then institutionally we have not gone maybe as far as saying, what do we need to do to get rid of development thought as it exists within this white Western space, right? So that's what I mean with the aim could and should be, how do we get rid of it without getting rid of the idea of solidarity and amplifying everything that we say, right? But whether we mean that literally breaking down whatever, or whether we mean that epistemically, where we say we need to be able to imagine its disappearance as abolition as a constructive move, where we clear the space so that we actually, I'm not going to say starts from scratch because, that's a very colonial way of thinking, but we need to clear some space. There's so much clutter. And I think I was reminded of that in very concrete ways, Kapana, when you give the example of SARS or what's in Nigeria, what's happening in India, and the natural human inclination of solidarity is indeed, we need to amplify and stop pretending that stuff is not happening and we actually have power, so let's amplify. The problem, what development has done, is that amplifying voices has often turned into a reproduction of a particular mastery, right? So, and it came through so clearly in the example that you gave, because it's true, the Nigerians or British people of Nigerian descent that are fighting anti-colonialism, anti-racism through Black Lives Matters, when they bring up SARS and the violence there, it's of such a fundamentally different nature than when I turn on BBC World, and they are almost in a celebratory way showing however broken the Nigerian state is yet again, right? But those are the things that come then in our classrooms where students come in with these topics, with these questions, luckily, but so much labor needs to go through. Maybe that's one of the things that a network can think about, like how do we make these topics visible, discussable in terms of solidarity without wanting again to to extract them and colonize them for the next project of control, or the next project that needs to reassert how superior the Western model is over the others, right? And that's something that I'm generally struggling with. And that's why I've, like, the very abstract label of both abolition, in terms of we need to start understanding what we need to stop doing, but also we need to very consciously move away from desires of mastery. They need to go hand in hand with what we then need to think in terms of more constructive approaches. And I think for at least the next 50 years in Europe, we should not, I mean, again, the wide European context here, we should not think of anything else than repair what we keep on breaking, rather than, even, like, as I said, often the language of aid is obscene. It's not just a slip of the tongue. It's not, and development has become super implicated in that, right? But development, I know, can mean so many different things. It can mean better adaptability to our environments. It can be a sign of life, but that's not what it is. And that's not even where we're starting from. So I would say trying to think of what needs to go, and is vague, and it can be many different things. But I think some of the language of abolition allows us to do that. But at the same time, we also see abolition being co-opted in many different ways. So again, I'm not wedded to these words, but to the politics behind it, maybe. And then the other is repair. And again, people, finally, we start talking about reparations, and then it's reduced to what we can calculate, whatever. It's not, maybe it's also a politics of repair, first of all. And that answers for me the very situatedness of how a European decolonizing aspect is to that. And I think what then comes through is that, in very practical terms, if we were to decide that this can be a network that amplifies what needs to be amplified, it will always have to go hand in hand with the listening, right? And if we get that Rosaba was talking about, so if we get a redefinition of amplification as a practice of listening, I think that somehow highlights the actual challenge. And I'm not going to say, and we have to accept that it's impossible, whatever. But there is something to that where, again, we can't reproduce a desire that we're going to be the networks that's going to show to Europe what decolonization looks like, right? Like, there needs to be some humility that we need to find somewhere in this. And I don't know, for me, language of abolition and repair helps. But as I said, it's just ways of thinking through this, but not necessarily, these are the next buzzwords that we all need to get on board with. So yeah, that would be what I have to say here at this point. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think, that's definitely very important point is, the goal cannot be to, tell everyone what the true definition is and what the true practice is, but we actually need to start at home and with ourselves. I think that's the best advice. We want to, I want to thank you all for, giving us such a rich debate and rich conversation. And there's, I've so many sheets with notes, so there's a lot to be further discussed. But now we want to open the floor, because a lot of questions have flown in from participants. And I will just read out the first one, which was directed to you, Olivia, but I guess we can, everyone feel free to say something, which was, if development gets abolished tomorrow, what do you need to see happen in the NGOs active in the industry the next day for meaningful decolonized action? So basically, that's the question we have. Also, the long debate within post-development theory, if this whole apparatus has failed, it still continues to exist and it won't disappear overnight. So what can NGOs invested in this apparatus do? Olivia, or anyone, please.
Okay, are we gonna do one-on-one, or are we gonna collect some questions? I'm happy to answer, but I don't know, like, if you said there are many questions, maybe.
We can collect.
I could read another one if you want.
Yeah, maybe we do 3 and then.
Okay, I'm going to read another one. Do you want me to read the second one, for example?
Yeah, please go ahead, Juan.
Okay, we have another question also for all of you. It says, how can we think of decolonization in the context of national development in post-colonial states, which might involve new actors from national elites to local communities that see an empowering and even decolonizing potential in development, thereby reproducing the same logics. So yes, the question asks like, okay, development is so embedded in everything that many people even find it useful for decolonization. So how can we change it or think it otherwise? Julia, would you like to read the third one? Otherwise I...
Yes, and we take the third one, which is, should we spend our energy on the appropriation of SDGs? Besides the
United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. Yes.
Okay, sorry, the UNDRIP. Is there any conversation related to decoloniality at UN level? Or is there hope in terms of looking at global governance structures?
Okay, Lata brought the questions there, so thanks a lot, Lata.
Yeah, so we take these three, and please feel free to respond to any aspects.
Yeah, so thank you for these questions. I think they are important to the extent that they often arise, and I think in that sense that's why it's always worth coming back to them. And so one is, and again I'm going to butcher and simplify it, but what's going to happen to the NGOs if we decolonize development? I'm saying this with a smile, and I know that the question is more profound than that, but and the other is, people in the global south seem to also want this development that we all now have discovered that is not a good thing, right? And I think in a way the last question as well, apart from NGOs, what with the global institutions and the structures, and how do they relate? Or are they salvageable, or should we keep them when it comes to these decolonial questions? And so I'm not going to sidestep the question by saying that we might not always be talking at the same level, as in there are practical translations of a lot of the blah that can be also expressed, first of all, maybe at the level of imagination or level of epistemology. But similarly, I would say that if we were talking about what happens in the classroom, what happens as researchers or whatever, it is a particular attachment to mastery, the desire to be present. A scholar like Mira Sabaratnam talks about protagonismo, for instance, that is very much embedded in both the thinking and the practice of development. I would maybe invite people, rather than think immediately, oh no, what's going to happen with NGOs, or actually the good meaning people that work for them. You know, everybody puts blood, sweat, and tears in there on a daily basis. This is not a dismissal of it. But the invitation is the same. Is about investigating what they are wedded to and what they're supposed to do versus what they're actually doing and being able to accomplish. And I think in that sense, it is about an honest conversation. What is the contribution of particular NGOs in the status quo of racial colonial capitalism? That's the question. It's not saying that so you can't even answer it saying like, what do they need to do tomorrow? What do they need to do tomorrow is actually doing a mental exercise on how they could imagine their disappearance. Because in the first place, in any case, what is supposedly the logic of the NGO world is that if they're successful, they're not needed anymore. And we tend to forget that, right? That is actually the purpose of the aid or the development industry. If they are successful, they are not needed anymore. And so that's the thing that somehow then disappeared. At the same time, that does not translate into, we cannot organize, whether it's in NGO, social movements or whatever, to effect positive change, right? So in a very practical way, my first answer would be the model of mastery that is at the heart of NGOs is often going to the global south or controlling what happens in the global south. It's not that big of a leap to turn around, transform that, and organize ourselves as lobbyists that try to limit the damage that is done at the hearts of our power institutions to the global side. I'm not saying that NGOs are not doing it. A lot of them have diversified their activities to doing both. But this attachment of presence and protagonismo in the global south, even if we're not there physically, but we're there epistemologically, we're there financially, and all of that, that is something that also from the NGO world, an engagement with abolitionism, that's what I mean, I think, right? So I think that that destabilizes the question itself, I think, because the question somehow maybe expresses more a desire to continue to be relevant rather than rephrasing the core question: how can development be an industry? Industry is a bad word. Technology is also a bad word. But how can it be a network for life rather than what we're doing now? So that should be the core concern rather than how can we survive this new buzzword that is decoloniality. That's what I would say. In terms of the desire for neoliberal development that we can detect obviously many places in the global south, here I would invoke again very deeply situatedness. So it depends who's asking the question, who's going to answer it for whom. Analytically, I can say it is really important to keep that in the equation when we're trying to think through how do we decolonize our thinking about how we understand that economic development can be in anything and everything. But it's also sometimes it's also sometimes sorry, I've lost my train of thought because I hear something. A continuation of not a continuation. I feel sometimes it's an expression of the very limited way in which we've understood diversified knowledges by freezing it into almost identity politics or even geopolitics of knowledge, where we say, oh, if it's from the global south, hence it's going to be more true by definition, or or we have to listen to. But it's a way in which it disempowers, again, in a way, how to take fundamentally different positions to poverty, historically and in the present, seriously, right? So the short answer would be like, I don't always feel comfortable to respond to that for the people concerned. I do think that conversations about decoloniality need to be had everywhere. But depending on who's asking this in what context, we can give each other a genealogy of how, I don't know, again, it would be so obscene for me even to say anything of that, having access to a monthly wage and all of that, right? But there are situations in which when you are grounding or in conversation with colleagues or friends or family in the global south, you have a conversation that is much more listening than me formulating now how legitimate or illegitimate that desire is. But at the same time, we do need, there is relationality in that question that needs to be addressed together. But I'm not sure that is always possible if we do this when we are locked in the places that we are. And I know it's a bit vague. I can think of more concrete examples later on, but that's also where often I engage in more listening than talking, right? But it just depends what the actual institutional or personal context is of these conversations. But I would agree with the question to the extent I would not deny that is an actual reality. But my next thing would be like, yeah, wouldn't you? But it's just, I just think that if you have the privilege and the luxury to look at the destruction that modernity and capitalism have brought materially, even just sit with that would be already deeply important, I think.
Okay, so Kalpana, Rosalba, as you want. Kalpana?
Yeah, I mean, I also kind of was very interested in the questions, and particularly I wanted to say something about the second question about you know actors in post-colonial states who see potential in development and thereby reproducing the same logics. I mean, I agree. I think that what we need to be very careful in that context, because I think that firstly there's everything that Olivia said in relation to kind of what she called neoliberal desires for development, but I think also there is often a kind of strategic use of the notion of development, which also can be quite transformative. So I don't think that everybody in every location and if every positionality who talks about development means the same thing at all, And I think that, you do have, for example, the use of the whole kind of, you have indigenous communities who are saying, well, this is not the development which you promised us, this is something else. And that then has a very different meaning from, the kind of development which we are kind of talking about as being wholly destructive and kind of imperial, and colonial. So I think it's very important not to sort of like have this very blanket approach to kind of to what development may mean to different people in different places at different times. And I think it's been as much a site of struggle over that term as it has been something which has always been in and of itself oppressive. So I think that that's something that I would approach very, very carefully. And the other thing also, I think I would say the same actually to an extent about modernity, because I think, just having looked at different contexts coming across this, I wanted to use this example of India because it's one that I know a little of, but it's really not always that straightforward, for example, because here you have a situation where you have a dominant regime and dominant class which is very much now appropriating these ideas of decolonizing, which is invoking a pre-colonial history, even as its policies are completely embedded in neoliberal corporate imperialism. And then you have, for example, the Dalit ideologies, which very much draw on Ambedkar and so on, which are very much embracing particular notions of modernity as a strategy of resistance to that kind of caste supremacist system. So there are all these complexities and contradictions which we have to kind of embrace, rather than kind of always assuming that we need to also think about multiple understandings of modernity and multiple kind of mobilizations of what modernity means, and how it can also be embraced in a kind of way which is liberatory. So I think all of these things I think are very, very important questions. And I think that very often we also need to think about the fact that the way people, we've talked a lot about the global, but the way people experience that is often about very very specific local struggles and contradictions and encounters. And I think we do need to, I think, just as from my sort of, I suppose, activist experience, I do feel like solidarity still has a very important place. I think that, if I think there are a lot of contexts in which we are called upon to show solidarity with people who are experiencing, acute repression and violence and silencing from the state, which is not a European state, which is a state in the global south. And while that is difficult and uncomfortable, I think we then have to do the work of showing how those states are also, embedded in wider global structures, how they're enabled by, by the West, how they're trained, how they're, constantly shored up and reproduced, and we have to do that work. But I don't think we can allow the need for that work to prevent us from showing that solidarity with those for whom, it is states and elites and powerful groups in the global south who are their immediate enemy and threat to their life. So yeah, that's what I say, I think, to those questions.
Rosalba?
Well, I always say that I don't do development. I have never studied development. Nonetheless, I'm a product of development. No? So having said that, I should also say that I did work for an NGO when I was in Mexico. And this question that is being posed is actually something that I constantly receive from students in ICES who are very much invested in working in NGOs back home, and back home in most of the cases, the so-called global south. Now, the way I can approach this question and also a conversation with the students is constantly remember together that this period of, let's say, neoliberal mentality and neoliberal governmentality exercised through NGOs is a very specific historical period in which all these technocrats of aid are very much something that many of us are critical, even if we at certain point were part of these structures. And the way we have been reflecting about is actually to talking to people that were active in not NGOs. These were called solidarity networks. These were called, networks of solidarity to refugees here in the Netherlands or in other places. To try to also remember that this brief story is something that we need to keep in mind when we think on what happened after development disappears and with development NGOs. Because what we have seen here is a very specific also history of international solidarity. And this also gives us hope and gives us the possibility of thinking that not always everything was organized around the law framework or these kind of tools that we use or that people use in NGOs to be efficient, and that there is an horizon that actually is not necessarily in the future, that might come also from other stories of international solidarity. This is what I can offer now as a tentative answer to that particular question. Now, in terms of the new actors and how they are in some cases using the notion of decolonization, I think that this is something that I have been studied through the people that has been invested in pointing at the limits of state institutions, state logics in processes of decolonization. And I have in mind people like Catherine Walsh and her excellent critique against, excellent critique, not necessarily against, but excellent critique on how the agenda of decolonization brought into Bolivia and Ecuador actually show its limitation once it was translated as an agenda to transform the state through logics of the state, which is a deeply colonial structure. So this is one way of thinking about it. The other way is actually something that Kalpana has already mentioned before. I think that it was Kalpana, now I cannot remember, but this idea of going back and learn from recent stories of decolonization, of how, I think that it was Ghana, how in the 1950s or in the 1960s, actually, some of the leaders were thinking and articulating that decolonization of knowledge, education, higher education, etc., was actually being thought, discussed. So I think that there are plenty of, let's say, examples, scholars that have been grappling with this particular question that can be also stimulate a conversation on the impossibilities of doing decolonizing work through colonial institutions and logics. Now, in relation to the last question, I think that what I want to highlight here is perhaps one of the specific differences or tensions of what brings a decolonial positionality and a decolonial genealogy of thinking about, let's say, the terms we use, such as modernity. Let me try to do this in 1 second or 2 seconds. I think that there is a lot of work that has been done to appropriate and re-signify the parameters given by the United Nations Indigenous, UNIDP. I cannot remember the whole thing. And this is interesting. It's fascinating, the kind of research that has been done. But these are given parameters, as I have already mentioned. I think that the decolonial path is in another direction. And the direction that we are learning from struggles of resurgence and self-determination is the path of autonomy. Many scholars, decolonial scholars, activists have said, well, we are interested not in being in a process of re-signifying an ongoing conversation, but actually we want to change the parameters of that conversation, the terms of those conversations, and of course the terms of those institutions. So, and this is also related to something that I really want to highlight. I think that in a decolonial perspective, our idea of modernity and on the basis of work of scholars and activists since the early 1990s, but before, is that we cannot speak about modernity without coloniality. We simply cannot anymore say, I think that modernity is hybrid, is has different sources and is fluid, and the South has constantly contributed, and then we have to reassert that our connected histories construct that idea of a multiple modernity and complex modernity. For us, this is not enough anymore. That's why we are constantly speaking as modernity, as coloniality, or modernity, coloniality. Why? To stimulate this idea, this way of thinking that even in that hybridity, there is a process of silencing, there is a process of erasure, there is a process that denies that even in a hybrid understanding of modernity, there is a lot that is being deauthorized, erased, and so forth. And in many cases, this happens through very specific frameworks and genealogies of thinking that has as its historical origin Western modernity, dominant Western modernity and dominant Western frameworks of understanding of what is supposed to be human, reality, and so forth. So in that way, I think that our path is also very specific in terms of understanding that we don't want to be modern. This is something that we're constantly mentioning. We don't want to be modern. We don't really want to. And because this is a failed project. We're not anymore for understanding the potentials of a modern world. We're actually trying to desprendernos the link from its lie, its problematic logics, because this is very much implicated on the logics of the state, which is deeply violent, and the logics of capitalism. So we cannot disassociate modernity from a state, or the logics of the state, which is extremely violent towards nations, and we cannot disassociate from the logic of capitalism. So that's why we are constantly speaking about modernity as coloniality, or modernity coloniality. I hope that makes some sense. I was running. Sorry.
It makes sense. Okay, it's 6:10. We said that we will continue a few more minutes. So I will ask 3 more questions, and probably we are going to have time to at least give some ideas about them. I'm going to share 3 questions. First one is more addressed to Olivia. The question is, if development is a lie, as a radical Black activist, what narratives are you asking us to engage in or to create for decolonizing research cost action? And then there are 2 questions related with corporate power. I'm going to read them as I have them here. One of them says, can we address the problem of colonial responsibility now? For example, corporations as main drivers influencing the society, an academy through education, media, etc. And the other question says, if colonialism continues through corporate land grabbing, how does this narrative include the land grabbers who are wealthy power holders in their own society? So feel free. I can see Rosalba like thinking deeply, like, oh, this is too much. I don't know.
Can you repeat the second question, please?
The second one, yes. Can we address the problem of colonial responsibility now? For example, corporations as main drivers influencing the society and academy through education, media, etc. Maybe Lata, could you? Yes, that's what you are doing. Copying you have the questions. So feel free to. Maybe Olivia, the first one was addressed to you. So if you want to start.
Let me unmute myself. Yeah, so what to engage with? I think, yeah, I mean, radical Black activists, I think sometimes there's certain tradition where certain things come up more explicitly than others. But as I often say, and it's not necessarily an inclusive move, but I think as a really conscious fight against the divide and conquer that colonialism has brought us, but in a positive way, what I learned from engaging with Black radical thought, Black feminist radical thought, it is, and I think it's deeply relevant to again, very specifically for a European network, let's say, or us based in Europe. I'm in the UK, and apparently we're not in Europe anymore, but we know what that means. I find it useful to organize my thinking and practices around politics of life, or what Enrique Dussart called the will to life. On the one hand, and then slightly more specifically, maybe even if we just try to address racial capitalism, I would say that that's a particular expression of that. It is helpful to the extent that, as has been mentioned numerous times here, it allows us to make sure that we don't do the fake-ass anti-racist work that really limits ourselves just to identity politics on the one hand, or being nice, or not saying racial slurs and all of that, but understanding that it's something that is on the one hand deeply connected to political economy. So I would say if we don't address capitalism, then it's just going to be very difficult to call ourselves decolonial for longer than 5 minutes on the one hand. But then the other aspect of racial capitalism is that it is a targeted vulnerability of premature death of certain peoples. And also that we can make that very specific. In Europe today, if we do not address the fact that some people die crossing the Mediterranean and others don't, then we're not doing anything remotely related to politics of life. And I would say that is deeply invested in what we used then to call development, whatever. We don't have to go even that far. It's literally happening at the doorstep. So, so that's what I would say. I just distinguishing, and again, that's quite at the abstract level, but distinguishing between these desires for power versus the desires to contribute to life. And that is quite abstract, but to make it concrete in Europe, again, deep down, if we look inside, we know what that entails. And it entails addressing capitalism, addressing neoliberalism, and all the different ways it tries to co-opt whatever radical change that people are asking for. And very specifically, not being afraid to call out whiteness when it happens. And the reason why it's important to call it out is because that always means the premature death of the others that are, racialized differently. And so I keep it quite broad to say that it's not even about having a particular agenda with particular topics. I just think that everybody, whatever topics that we are engaged in, our everyday life activism, or just, how you raise your kids, these things pop up in every single thing that we do. So it's not even about closing an agenda. I would say the life and making sure that whatever has to do with representation and presence and absence and erasure is always going hand in hand with the material aspects of that, which again circle back to who gets to live, who gets to die, and who gets to decide the quality of life of others. Or as was said beforehand, I think it was Rosalba, those whose life is consumed, and those, Rosalba, you're better at that. I wrote it down because I thought it was very powerful. But this idea of those who consume the life of others and of Earth, and those who are consumed by the others. I think that's just a really powerful way, and it's not rocket science because we can see it in everyday life, right? So that, and again, I can answer that from a Black radical tradition, but it's clear that is not a particular or the only way from which this comes. It's the broader definition of political Blackness, which is obviously a relation to a particular relation with empire that has informed people's understanding of the preciousness of life.
Thank you, Olivia. I was thinking that if we continue asking you all questions, this is a kind of extractivism from our speakers. So Kalpana and Rosalba, feel free to answer as you have energy, and because we've been more than 2 hours here. So, and also remember, this is the beginning of the network. So hopefully we are going to have a lot of conversations like this, and which is really great. So let's not burn all our energy just in today. Kalpana, Rosalba, anything to add? Your answers?
Shall I go, Kalpana? The question, Olivia, this is a question that more and more we call the decolonial ethical question, and the most beautiful part of it is that it doesn't come from a single mind, but it comes from several conversations. And we also try to speak about that question of as a generative question that stimulates others to think about how we are implicated in the consumption of the life of Earth and others. And we are constantly questioning if development studies in this particular setting is able to speak about that question and how. So it's a beautiful question because it generates many reactions. Corporate power. I think that Kalpana already said something that I really want to re-emphasize here. Cost as an explicitly anti-colonial network. And I want to emphasize this because many of the groups and communities with whom I work back in Aviala are networks and communities that don't want to know anything about or work with the European Commission or the European Union because of their incapacity to be protected, be encouraged to continue their resistance against, for example, green technologies that are, appropriating their lands, while generating capital and generating capital, but also well-being to pensioners in Spain, in the Netherlands, and in the UK. And these are communities that, if I go and said, hey, there is this network and we want to do this, they perhaps will immediately say, we don't want to know anything about the European Union because it's not explicitly anti-colonial and therefore anti-capitalist, or has an explicit critique to these neo-corporate land grabs in which citizens of Europe are actually benefiting from. So I think that this is how I want to address this question, and I think that this is a very important contribution of Kalpana, and actually posing it as a question: how far can we actually be explicitly anti-colonial in this network? yes, and the question of internal colonialism. I think that the third question is how difficult is to grapple with internal colonialism, and how this is actually expressed through the logics of land grabbing by the new elites. Some of them are not new, are actually very long, from very long processes of appropriation and destitution. And the way we have been working with others as decolonial feminists is with this idea of internal colonialism that in the context of the Spanish-speaking world was coined by Pablo González Casanova, like I don't know how many decades ago, and then undertaken by Dussel and by many other theorists and scholars of what now is named as decoloniality, and also, of course, Quijano. But this is something that we have to also grapple with. And this is something that I constantly remind to my students also in ISS, especially when they want to, please remember that they come from the so-called global south. And then the discussions in the classroom are like, okay, yeah, everything is about the north. And I say, like, the moment you speak English and you are here, you are an elite. So please, it's not as simple as that. How are you actually contributing to this internal colonialism, and what can you do? Because most of them go back to work in NGOs, to work in development planning offices and so forth. Then what is your role and your responsibility in undoing that internal colonialism? And by internal, of course, they only think in internal or within the national borders of a national state, but I'm also pushing them into thinking in terms of their subjectivity and notions of selfhood. But that's for another conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think completely agree with what Rosalba said, and I think that's a good point to end on. The coming back to what that anti-colonialism could look like. And I think it's really important to now recognize that when we talk about global capital, when we talk about imperialism, it doesn't always look like the face of a European company. It isn't always, that too, they've got that diversification. You've got, diversity in the boardroom, right? You've got all those things happening. You've got this kind of, the subcontracting. You've got the kind of chains. You've got the value chain. So, of course, we're not surprised when we see local elites and power holders very much integrated within those processes of expropriation and dispossession and so on. So I think and in a way, what we're talking about then is about that it isn't only about location, it's also about politics. And I think that's kind of really what we're all saying here. That, when we talk about decolonial projects, they are projects which have a particular politics and which we have to be very, very clear about. And I think that's something which we have a responsibility to think about all the time and think through, as Rosalba said, with our students, both those who are from the global north and those who have come from the global south, in kind of always critical ways.
So yeah, I can see that in many of the backgrounds it has gone dark. And indeed we've been spending two and a half very intense hours here. So I really very deeply want to thank you for this very challenging but also very stimulating conversation. And the good thing is that we will be able to continue this over the next 4 years and hopefully even longer, and build on several conversations. Also, I want to say that the many questions that we weren't able to tackle now, we will take them to the working groups and take them up there. So many thanks to you, Kapana, Olivia, Rosalba, for sharing, for discussing. It has been a great pleasure. And we hope to continue the conversation, and then also at one point also share the physical, the face-to-face community again. So everyone else, thank you for attending. Thank you for being here, and please keep in touch.